In the last 7 years, the number of Kenyan firms facing liquidation has more than doubled. This casts a spotlight on the weakness in evoking and enforcing the legal administrative processes on insolvency. Latest data from Kenya's State Receiver Office shows that 46 companies are currently facing a liquidator's armor, up from 18 in 2015. Of these, companies grappling with court sanctions liquidations increased to 34 from 13, while those under voluntary liquidation grew to 12 from 5. The damning statistics paint a grim picture of the country's insolvency law that requires financially troubled firms to be given time to recover through an administration procedure, with liquidation being the last resort. Reviving a company under administration is an arduous task because calls are made to them when companies' financial health has deteriorated beyond repair. There are also other issues of lack of cooperation from directors and management, troubled firms running out of resources, particularly financial, securing the top talent required to rescue the company, and of course, a spurious litigation. Now, joining the conversation from Nairobi, Kenya, is Lekan Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst and CEO, Rich Management. It's nice to have you join us, Lekan, once again on Business Edge.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, some Kenyan firms are currently facing liquidation. According to reports, the numbers have doubled in the last 7 years. What's actually the bane for the seeming collapse?
So I think, we've had a very difficult economy for the last few years since the pandemic, post-pandemic. And I think, these data points reflect that fact. You can't spin this story in any other way. It signals difficulties in the economy, and it's signaling, that those difficulties have increased. And this is a fact. We've had a very slow economy since the pandemic, and companies have found it very difficult to thread this needle.
So then why is there a perceived weakness in the legal regime on insolvency in Kenya?
So I think, the weakness I would suggest is that it's taking far too long to put zombie companies, as it were, into liquidation. Have these scenarios where administration plays out for a very long time, and companies are able to use the court system to slow down the moment of liquidation. So I think this is something that the country and the government needs to look at to speed up the process, so that, companies that don't have a life anymore can essentially be put into liquidation more quickly, and also look at our bankruptcy laws to see if they are being effective.
Well, during the course of the conversation, we get to dwell more on what needs to be done to speed up the process. But then latest data from Kenya's State Receiver Office showed that 46 companies are currently facing liquidators' armor, up from 18 in 2015. Now, what does this mean for the corporate business environment and, of course, the country's economy?
So it's, as I said, it's signaling to us that the economy is quite soft. It's signaling to us that there are more companies in ICU. And I think it's also signaling that, this process of administration has not necessarily been effective for a number of those companies that you're characterizing. So I simply think that the main takeaway is headwinds in the economy, which have made it more difficult for some of these companies to navigate their way through it.
Now, ideally, what is the time span, and what sort of financial or administrative mechanisms are required when you want to save or salvage a company that is near collapse or nearing liquidation in Kenya? What are the processes to ensure that the insolvency laws take effect?
So, there's several processes. Courts quite often appoint administrators first when they see a company is in difficulty. The problem is that, when you appoint an administrator, the administrator is trying to keep the company going, but it might not really have a future. So keeping it on life support might not be as effective as simply allowing it to go straight into liquidation. So you have a court-appointed administrator in normal circumstances, and if that doesn't work, you then go into liquidation. That is the sort of 1-2-step process that these companies go through.
And according to polls recently conducted, it showed that reviving a company under administration in most cases is near impossible because these companies tend to call for an SOS when they have actually hit rock bottom. So why do they actually wait till when there's a red flag and they're on code red before they call for help?
Because it's quite interesting. I think these companies, I can give you examples. One is Mumia Sugar, another is Uchumi. And the situation is it has a shareholding in these companies, and the government becomes a brake on the capitalist process of the company dying and a new company being reborn. So you get a lot of scenarios where it is clear that the company does not have a future, but administration is the most political solution for the time being. It's essentially kicking the can down the road. And there's a lot of that going on, I'm afraid. And it goes on until it's just no longer possible. So I would say that, the cases you're citing, there tends to be some government involvement in there, and therefore these tough decisions are not being taken when they should be.
All right, now I'm looking at these companies. Is it all companies that are eligible for recovery when on the verge of liquidation, or there are some parameters that are considered in terms of privileges and, of course, posture?
So I think in most cases, these companies could have a future, but it's essentially the structure around the company. As I said, quite often the government, for example, has stakes in about 800 corporates in Kenya, which simply doesn't make any sense. And if you look at a lot of these companies that you're citing, they're part of that group of 800. So really, I think, to get back on track, the government has to divest itself of stakes and loss-making businesses and go through a process and allow the private sector, if it wants, to come in as a shareholder. We had this happening in under the Kibaki administration, where there was a massive move by the government to divest itself, to get out of business, as it were, to remain in core business, but avoid being in any business which wasn't core. I think that's a reform program that this government should embrace.
I understand the fact that you're dwelling more on what the government must do, but then let's also look at what these companies must do, because, of course, they are the ones who bear the brunt of the meat all. Now, at critical points, when these companies know that they are financially insolvent, or they know that they cannot meet their financial obligations, and they begin to notice traces of underperformances, instead of living in denial, what should be the first steps that they need to take?
So you're absolutely correct. I mean, this is corporate surgery. This is a speciality of business, some businesses. I think, a lot of companies somehow believe that there's going to be a Hail Mary pass that they can throw and put themselves back on track. It's very difficult also when you're inside an organization to truly understand at times that the moment has passed you by and you need to now look at a liquidation or look at an exit. So I think, you're talking about a corporate culture, and I think we need to embrace a more aggressive corporate culture. So the sense that, when it is clear, when the writing's on the wall, there should be a very fast process. But I think the problem then becomes you have different constituencies within an organization. You have workers who have to be treated fairly. And in many cases, these companies will just kick the can down the road till they can't pay salaries, and that becomes the end. But, as you've said, it would be wise to take action early, and it would be wise to bring in external support to assist in taking that action early, because quite often the management won't have that experience that's required to deal with a company that's already in ICU.
All right. Lekan, during the course of your response, you talked about administrative processes and, of course, the judiciary prolonging matters and drawing the situation beyond comparable. And what do you think the government can do to speed up the process? Because we know that some with a vested interest in situations like this milk fat out of it. What can be done to speed up the process?
That's a great question, and it's a great characterization. And there will be plenty of insiders in such a scenario whom it suits to string out the administration process because they're being compensated in some way for that process. And I think you've got to be able to say that if an organization is clearly not going to emerge from administration, and I think you've got to give it a time limit to establish that, or have regular checks where you're saying we're going to check every 4 weeks, and if we don't see any kind of improvement, then we're going to have to liquidate. So I think it's a question of looking at the law, looking at the process, and looking at speeding up all those processes.
All right, before we draw to a close, Lekan, we understand that there are conditions whereby the statutory administration is not well understood by these companies. How do we facilitate a kind of understanding so that they know the processes, they know what step that needs to be taken if they are hoping that their companies will not get liquidated at the end of the day?
That's very interesting, and I think that this is a very niche part of management education, and I think it would behove the corporate authorities to consider, the regulatory authorities to consider this part of the education process for senior management, so that if such scenarios unfold, they're not unprepared for them. So I think it's a question of corporate education. I think it's important, and I think if you empower management to better understand these sorts of challenges, you're going to get better outcomes.
Would you advocate that the insolvency law should be scrutinized, maybe upgraded in some areas, or you feel that what obtains now is adequate to run the show?
No, it's clearly not adequate. I think it's got to be scrutinized. I think it's got to be accelerated. I think there's got to be a deliberate intention to make the process faster, quicker, and any economy which is going to work well. Capitalism has a life cycle. Some companies don't succeed, then you get new companies that come up and they succeed. So it's a process of death and renewal. And if you are not allowing death to happen effectively, you can't allow renewal. So absolutely, I think if we're going to rejuvenate the economy under this new administration, we clearly have to look more closely at these types of laws. And I think there's a clear case for reform.
So invariably, Lekan, you're saying that if they're able to speed up the process and get the acts right, there will be some sort of improvement on the ease of doing business in the country.
That's essentially what I'm saying. And I think, it also is relevant. We're talking about more mature businesses, but it's also relevant for startups. It's relevant for fast growing early stage companies. Once you get this process right, you can have you might have a faster turnover. You might have quite a number of companies which are being pushed into this process. But at the end of the day, if you look at the economy as a whole, you get a much better outcome and a much faster outcome. You've also got to consider investors. Investors too, their interests need to be taken care of. And quite often an endless cycle of administration and then liquidation after a number of years is a very poor outcome for investors, whether they are government investors or individual private investors. So I think it's a win-win to look at reforming this thing. It's a win-win for everybody as long as you look at protecting people like employees, because quite often they get caught in the crossfire.
All right, thank you so much, Ali Khan. At least we're able to establish one fact that if they're able to reform and upgrade these laws and put it into effect, because there's another thing that has to do with implementation, enforcing it, then of course issues with companies getting liquidated probably might just fizzle out in the next foreseeable years. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you. Thank
Now,
you.
now a company is deemed unable to pay its debt if it fails to pay a debt of about 100,000 Kenyan shillings, which is about $826.44 dollars, so to speak, or more after 21 days of written demand. And this has been the case of businesses in Kenya for a while now, but the government has started making changes to the Insolvency Act to tackle the perceived weakness and sabotage in enacting the legal administration of insolvency laws. This, it hopes, will rescue as many companies from liquidation. We'll get into international business news in a bit, and that's going to be after this time out.